Okay, in this video we're going to tackle a short problem based on what we've learnt so far in week 2, and that's been included in the screencasts 1 through to 5. We have a simple problem here. An event organizer has to purchase drinks. We want to optimize the buying process, and we want to find the cheapest per unit cost. So that's just like when you go grocery shopping, you just want to try and get the cheapest per unit cost. So what we want to do, we want to write a Matlab script to find the cheapest per unit supplier. And the problem is that pricing quotes are given, but the units are mixed up. So not everybody offers the same product sizes, and the costs are different. So what we need to do, we need to sort out what's the cheapest supplier in terms of the per unit cost, and that is dollars per 100 mils. And what we need to make sure we're doing with this problem and every problem we tackle, we need to make sure we know what we're doing before we sit down to write the code. So there's a couple of ways of doing it, and what we want to emphasize in this course is that you write comments in a Matlab script or a function, whatever problem you're writing, before you write the code. This helps you get an idea of what you have to write, what the point is of what you're writing, and where you need to put it inside your code. Another thing that we want to emphasize is that you should try and produce a handwritten flow chart or a thought process or just some scratchings on a piece of paper to demonstrate what you're trying to actually solve, and that's what we've got here. So here's the problem that you might get, say it might be on an assignment or an exam. And so I've run through, highlighted what we need to find, made some notes, and so on the next page, here's some notes I've written. And this is what you will need to do when you tackle problems. You need to figure out what exactly you want from the problem, and this is the cheapest per unit cost. To get to this result, we need to take the data given, and we need to get the dollars per 100 mil for each supplier, and we need to find the minimum of the list. To do the first part, I've decided to use a for loop, as we've covered in week 2 so far. So we're going to loop over the array of costs. I'm going to produce an array from this data. So we need to loop over it, and for each supplier we need to use the costs given and the unit package data given to get a unit cost for each supplier. And here's a little rough idea of how I want to do it. So I'm going to loop over n, that's my counter variable n, from 1 to the length of data. So the length is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's always good to familiarize yourself with more Matlab functions such as length, so you can start to automate your process and make it more general. I could have put from n equals 1 to 6, but length data allows us to have as many suppliers in here as we want. And to compute this, I've thought up a little computation. So we're going to take the pack cost, so that's the dollars. So there's a bit of unit analysis involved here, so we need to look at the units of what we want. So the dollars per volume, and so that's dollars in terms of the pack cost. That's what we want here. And then I divide the cost by the volume for that pack, and I get the volume by multiplying the units per pack by the unit size. So the cost divided by the volume, and then I'm going to multiply it by 100 mils. There should be an L here, but the scanner must have cut that off. So this is the cost divided by the volume. That way I get cost per milliliter, and then I'm going to multiply that by 100 in order to get the cost per 100 mils, which is what our problem statement was. Then once I have that list of unit costs, I'm just going to insert a section of code in my for loop that checks the new unit costs that I compute at each for loop step, and I'm going to compare that to the current variable, that is the minimum cost. And if my new one is less than the previous one, that's great, and I'm going to save it to the new minimum cost variable. So it's not a complex problem. I've written out a solution by hand of how I would go about it in my head, and I've translated it to some rough computer instructions. Now I have that, we can go to Matlab. Let's start up a new script. I'll just move this window up so it fits nicely. Okay. So now we have a bit of a recipe for the problem. Let's go ahead and set it up. So we need to write comments. So given data, construct arrays containing cost, unit size, unit volume. Maybe a better word would be unit amounts. Maybe unit numbers and unit volumes. And this is going to come from here, 1, 2, 3. So I might have 3 vectors, one called cost, one called units, and one called size. And in that vector I'd be able to store this information. So I'd probably put that code here somewhere. So once I have that, once data has been constructed, for loop to iterate over each element. Let's say for loop to iterate over each supplier. And I'm going to compute unit cost. And that is the dollars per 100 milliliters. And I'm going to put some for loops in here. I'm going to put a single for loop, I should say, in here. Inside the for loop, I need to have if statement to determine if new unit cost is less than current minimum. Now, to begin with, in the very first iteration of the for loop, there's going to be no previous data to compare with. So with that in mind, we need to create a minimum cost that's going to, at the start, be very, very, very large, so that the very first time we run the for loop, so for supplier A, we need that result to be less than some initial starting value. So I might make that a very big number, such as 1 million or something, because looking at these numbers here, nothing's going to get on the order of 1 million. So now we have some handwritten code, a recipe of sorts. It's not exactly correct. You notice here, what I've written here won't work in Matlab, but the idea is that it's what we want to do in our heads and how we get that onto paper and then translated to a computer is the key concept here. So we've written some comments, we have a for loop, an if statement, and once we've decided which is the lowest unit cost, we probably want to display a result to the screen. So let's save that as week 2 drink cost.m. Okay, now we have some comments. There's no code at all, but there's comments. And now we have a framework to construct some code. Now we have an idea in mind. Instead of blankly staring at a screen with no comments, nothing, we now have a framework to slowly piece together some code. And that's better than what we had at the start, which was an empty slate. So now let's construct some data. So let's say cost is equal to, now let's just construct this 10.57. I'm going to use column arrays. Because column arrays are helpful in the for loop because there's only a single dominant dimension. So it's more of a list than anything else, and that's what I'm after in this situation. Alternatively, you could have grouped them all together in one big array. I've made a typo there. I put a comma instead of a period, and notice it came up red. So no matter how many times you've done this, you're still going to make mistakes every now and then. So you need to keep on your toes. Keep on your toes. So let's say units per pack is equal to 30, 12, 36, 24, 10, and 20. And unit size is equal to, now let's keep it in milliliters because we wanted units per 100 milliliters. So if that's the final result we want, that is, the volume is milliliters, let's keep it in milliliters. A common thing that people might do is rush into the problem without analysing the output we need. It's always helpful to keep some dimensional analysis or unit analysis in mind, because that can help save us some grief further on down the track if we're out by 1,000 or something. You might have missed the conversion from litres to milliliters. So I've copied this data over. That looks about right. Okay, so now we have our data. Let's just run it to make sure everything's there. We have cost, unit size, units per pack. Okay, now it's helpful every now and then to just type a little bit of code once you've got comments, construct a bit of code. Once everything's good, there's no errors, such as before when I had a comma in here. There's no errors here, there's no warnings down here. It's good to save it and run it to make sure nothing nasty is going to surprise us. Now we have to create a minimum cost, so let's call min cost equals, let's call it 1 million, 1 e to the 6. Save it, run it. Min cost. Didn't run, that's because I called it. There you go, that's min cost. Now let's just go back up and notice how I had these variables in here. A helpful thing to do is to clear the command line and also clear the workspace so that every time you run the script, you have a fresh slate and there's no existing variables that might interfere with your code. So if we run it again, you see it's now a blank slate and everything's nice. So now data's been constructed. Okay, now let's do a for loop. So let's go for, don't want caps lock, for n equals 1 to length. Now let's say length of cost. Let's try that, length cost, that's going to be 6, okay? And notice when you type a for loop, it says an end is missing. So let's chuck an end in there. What we can do now we have the framework, we can create the unit cost. Now what I should do up here is create a 0 array with space for unit costs. So unit cost is equal to zeros. It's a column, so that's going to be 6. So it's going to be length cost. It's a single column. Let's run that. We say unit cost C zeros, and as we go through the for loop, each of these elements is going to be filled up. This is pre-allocation, and it's a good practice. So let's say unit cost. Now let's index into unit cost. We saw it's a column vector with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements. So let's say that as we go, we're going to compute a value for each element in our for loop. So where n is going to be 1 through to 6. So on the very first time, it'll be unit cost at the nth location, which will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And that's computed according to the recipe we wrote, which is the pack cost divided by the volume times 100 mils. So let's go costs. Is that what it was called? It was just called cost divided cost n. That's the nth entry in cost, divided by, let's put some parentheses around here to make sure we get the order of operations correct. Units per pack, n times unit size n. So that's going to give us the cost per total volume of the package, and the total volume is going to be that's milliliters, so 30 times 380 will be some value in milliliters, divided by, that is divided by into the cost, and so that's going to be in dollars per milliliter. We now want to multiply it by 100 to get cost per 100 milliliters. So let's save that and run it. Let's see now, unit cost is now, we see now that is the result we have. Okay, so now we can probably straight away look at that and say unit cost, let's look for the smallest one. It would be that one. Okay, but that's easy for us to decide. Let's make the computer decide for us. So let's say if unit cost n, which is the value of the unit cost that has just been calculated, if it's less than min cost, which as we said before was a very large number. So if the current cost that we've calculated is less than the previous minimum value, let's then say that the min cost is now equal to unit cost n. So the minimum cost is now equal to the current unit cost we've just calculated. And that will be true, that will only happen if the new unit cost is less than the old one. So if the condition is true, we're going to execute this code. That's all we want to do, so we should put an end here. There's no errors here, so let's run it. Min cost is the result we saw. So now we have a result. Let's go through and print a result. So let's display the minimum cost is in dollars per 100 milliliter is display min cost. Display min cost. There you go. So this is a simple problem, and you could expand on this further by constructing another array that contains a list of suppliers A, B, C, D through to F. And then we could also have a check in here once we've decided a minimum cost. We could also pick out the supplier name, so that at the end of the result we could print display the minimum cost in dollars per 100 mils is the value, and that belongs to supplier N. I'll leave this as an exercise for you, but this has basically just been the problem solving process that we want you in this course to focus on. That is, given a problem, it might be a big worded problem, might be a simple mathematical problem. In any event, you need to figure out what exactly you need to find. You need to write down your thought process on what you need, how you're going to reach that final solution, and the steps that you will take yourself to find it, and how you may translate that to computer code. You don't need to write perfect Matlab code on paper, you just need to write some general structures that Matlab will be able to use. So write down a simple for loop construction, a simple if decision, and then we go through in Matlab, we write some comments reflecting the recipe we've written, and only then do we sit down and fill in the blanks with the code, and each time running a little bit after a little bit, so we don't write one large program, get to the end and run it, and there's error messages everywhere, because that's no fun for anybody. Okay, thanks.